Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And thanks so much for joining us here to learn about API security for the banking and fintech industries. I'm really pleased to have Dr. Nida Davis and Raghu Valipireddy join me here. Typical housekeeping items here to get started. We're going to have presentations from Nida and Raghu. I'll wrap things up. And we'll do Q&A at the end, and you'll see there is a Q&A window. Please submit your questions as they come to you, and we'll get through as many of them as we can at the end of the session. And with that, let's dive right in. We've had an incredible amount of interest in this topic, and I can see why with the fantastic speakers that we have here this morning, at least morning for me here in San Francisco. So Dr. Nida Davis, is senior cybersecurity advisor with the Federal Reserve Board. Spent the last 14 or so years there and has been really at the forefront of driving guidance and regulations for the banking industry. She has specific interests and expertise around APIs, and so we're absolutely thrilled to have you, Nida, to join us here. And I know you have some really interesting things to share, including some recent publications that are very relevant to our audience here. And Raghu, thank you for joining us, SVP, Chief Information Security Officer at Axos Financial, the holding company of Axos Bank and others. I think you've been there for 4 years now and have really been a leader in cybersecurity, including in the area of API security, formerly at we were formerly at, oh my goodness, where's my notes here? Ally Bank, thank you. At 4 years where you ran technology risk, governance, threat response as well. And just a quick note for everyone out there, Raghu, I know is hiring, has some very interesting roles and positions there. So if you're looking for a new adventure, couldn't recommend a better company to get involved with, and a really fantastic person to work with. So let's dive into the topic of today, API security best practices for the banking and fintech sector. Very relevant, pertinent topic area. And in fact, this is probably our most highly registered webinar that we've hosted. So a lot of interest here. APIs, as we well know, have really sort of transformed how we run our businesses and build our applications and form integrations. But it has also turned into a new source of risk. And that's what we want to talk about here today. So Nida, let me hand it off to you and we'll dive right in.
Thank you so much, Dan. So I will start with the conventional disclaimer that I am today not presenting the Federal Reserve Board views. I am here in my personal capacity. Anything I would say today and I would share with you is really the outcome of my own expertise and views on this topic. It does not represent the Federal Reserve Board. So having said that, I would like to start with talking to you about some of the risks and some of the mitigations that you could do to kind of benefit from APIs and also kind of make sure that you are managing their risks properly. So I would say that, there are three very important pillars in the digital transformation that include cloud, artificial intelligence, and APIs. Over the history of our digital transformation journey, we went from mainframe, client server to the web, and now the evolution or revolution of digital transformation and competitiveness and being able to kind of serve in new ways really depends on these three pillars: cloud, artificial intelligence, and APIs. And so because these are very important, I'd like to say let's not just look at them as risks to be kind of avoided or risks that we don't want to deal with. On the contrary, I would say they are the underlying engine of innovation, digital transformation. And there are companies actually that are starting in the fintech space and in many other spaces. They rely very heavily on the APIs as their underlying, platform to deliver services. And this is just going to continue. So this is a very important area. I'll start with the first risk. The lack of business-driven API governance is a real risk. Tinkering with API just from a technical perspective without really kind of working with the business owners, the data owners, making sure that whatever APIs are going to be developed and delivered are anchored and rooted in the business first principle is a risk. So I would say it's really important to make sure when you pursue an API strategy, make sure that it's business driven and that the business owners sign off on the levels of risks that they are willing to undertake as you move forward with your API strategy from an IT perspective. Next. The second risk, I have a very long history in enterprise architecture, and I'm a strong advocate of well-architectured platform solutions. You always have to have a very well-organized big picture before you move forward with kind of a tactical usage of these technologies, just because of as I said, they are very highly transformative and highly impactful. So lack of enterprise architecture planning for API security is a big risk. If the APIs are approached as kind of an add-on to existing applications and just like basically figuring out how to break into the internet without looking at the big picture of all of the layers of defense and depth that you need to secure them, they may become a source of risk for you. So I would say it's really important. Look at your architecture, look at the big picture, and integrate your API security strategy into that. You don't have to invent anything new. Just look at what you have and then just make sure that you connect the dots and integrate. Next. The third risk is lack of effective API security controls. And those go along the three, the traditional triad that we always worry about as security experts. And from a cyber perspective, the CIA triad is very important. I've seen in some of the APIs approaches, they just basically inherit the underlying asset from which they are trying to kind of deliver APIs and kind of transfer the trust or transfer the CIA triad into the APIs. That may not be really an effective approach. I would recommend that you look at the APIs as an asset to be registered, an asset to be managed, an asset that you would apply your CIA controls, and in particular also the AAA services for authentication, authorization, and accountability. These are very important to make sure that you are deploying very well managed APIs from a risk perspective. Next. This is the fourth and last risk, and I think it's one of the most important risks in the cyber world that we live today. So there is no like priorities in the listing that I have shared with you, but I see this as one of the most important risks in the context of cybersecurity. So lack of effective API threat modeling, whether you are a threat modeling based on the data flows or whether you are threat modeling based on the process flows, whether you are applying Stride or Dread, however your threat modeling plans are, if you don't approach APIs with effective API threat modeling and also API vulnerability testing, you have to really test quite a bit because those APIs are just going to be opening new threat vectors or new surfaces of attack onto the internet. And if they are wrappers around legacy applications, even more so, you really need to kind of focus on this practice of threat modeling and also very extensive API vulnerability test. That's very important. Next. So now that I have laid out those risks, I hope you're not afraid. There's nothing to fear. We're technologists, and risk comes with it always reward and also potential. So APIs are going to open great potentials for old legacy applications to be wrapped and reused, or maybe like to start new services. It's really important to not just look at the risk from a negative perspective. There's also very positive aspects to risk taking that drive innovation, drive new services, drive new delivery, and enhances the competitiveness of the US financial sector. So, as long as you manage the risk and as long as you lay out plans, these are very important pillars that, I believe, and this is my own personal belief as Nida Davis, that cloud artificial intelligence APIs are very critical, just as was the web technology when it came forward to enable e-commerce and new forms of economic delivery of services. Very important pillars that are going to take you into the 21st century. So what do we do to make sure that we leverage? We identify the APIs before the attackers find them. You don't want kind of shadow IT, or you want to make sure that you have a good grasp on the registration. Particularly, a lot of APIs use privileged accounts to access the backend. So make sure you register, you discover, you make sure that all of the APIs are, you have your CASBs to the cloud, you have your sensors to find out what APIs are being delivered through your infrastructure organization. So the discovery piece is very important. Second one is the identification of operational resilience risks and also the supply chain risks. If your organization, there's a plethora of third-party APIs, and as I said, many fintech companies, they don't even have data centers. They're just leveraging a collection of APIs and delivering their own. So the third-party risks, supply chain risks, you all have seen the SolarWind attack. So make sure you kind of have a good grasp on what risks you are dealing with at the operational resilience level and the supply chain in particular. I would say also identify continuous security testing. So there are traditional approaches to security testing, but I would encourage you to consider and apply continuous, as we do continuous monitoring, also continuous testing. So you want to be more proactive on the functional security, on the threat modeling, and on the vulnerability. This is very important aspect of security. Lastly is protection. Of course, you want to protect your enterprise, and you want to integrate the APIs not as a one-off. You want them integrated into your fabric of all the layers that you have put in for defense in depth, for your enterprise architecture, and for your CIA. Next. And this is my last slide for you. There is guidance. We have published Architecture, Infrastructure, and Operations Handbook. If you have not read it or you don't know about it, I encourage you very much so to kind of, make yourself familiar with it. The examiners will be looking at security and architecture, infrastructure, operations through the lens of this particular handbook. There's good information in it. And the key areas for you to consider as you continue to move forward, A is API risk management, and look at it as a platform of innovation, digitalization. Make sure that you have the proper governance and controls, and that it's business driven, business owned, and it's very clear that you have business drivers behind it. So it's important to do that, particularly on the privileged account ownership and sign off on the use of privileged accounts to have access to back-end systems, to the internet. And lastly, of course, treat APIs as part of your enterprise security architecture, not as a one-off. Integrate them into your fabric. With that, I want to thank you so much for your time today, and I'll hand it back to you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nida. Really, really interesting. And for everyone out there, I do recommend that you take a look at this architecture, infrastructure, and operations document released just about 6 months ago. And quite interesting to see how Nida has added all of this focus on APIs. You'll see entire sections dedicated to API security in this FFIEC handbook. So with that, I couldn't think of a better segue than to Raghu, and someone who's really on the front lines of API security, protecting his financial institution and living the day-to-day challenges of securing a financial business. So Raghu, let's hand it off to you.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, folks. Before we dive into the core part of the presentation, a little bit about our background and Axos. We're formally considered as a mid-sized financial services organization. Axos Financial is a holding company for Axos Bank. We also have a clearinghouse and a robo-advisory firm. And, we're headquartered in San Diego, where you have about, 1,200 people in the company, and a lot more APIs. As the company that's born digital, we put a lot of emphasis on APIs, to the fact that, there's a joke in the company that there's probably an API there to refresh the coffee filter in the office. So we're one of those companies, we sort of adopted APIs all in back in the day, and they, form a strong foundation for us, and they enable us to support our business and different products, as well as, they allow us to be very agile, release new products or tweak and update products very quickly, and also innovate, right? As we think about, the new products that we envision in future, such as crypto and other areas, APIs have been a strong element that we rely upon to create those products from ground up. So back in the day, right, as a CISO, I started to see a shift in the weaknesses that we were identifying. 10 years ago, most of the secure organizations would see weaknesses either from pen tests or you find the security holes that you're worried about. They started to go from being a traditional web security weaknesses to API. And I think that shift probably is something that we all are seeing regardless of the industry, right? Gone are the days where you're worried about weaknesses that allow you to, or allow the hacker to deface a website or steal information based on traditional, SQL injection or cross-site scripting things. Nowadays, if you guys have done any testing of your websites, you'll probably see that the trend has completely changed. There are very little traditional web app security holes as opposed to API. And I too personally saw that shift, a few years ago. And because of the reliance on APIs, we started to wonder, how are we going to address this? How do we get our hands around this API security so that, we have command and control in this space? So what I'm going to do today is share our thought process as a mid-sized organization. What are some of the things we started to see? What did we see as controls or levers for us to contemplate on what to pull to control this risk? And when we looked into the market, what did we find in general? And what are we doing today to address that risk? So I'm going to high level talk about it, but I also want to make sure, you guys keep questions coming up so that when we get to the Q&A, we can talk specifics about, what exactly did we do, why we did so, and why we didn't pursue, other approaches that, may be mainstream or maybe things that are being applied in the industry in other organizations. So let's go to the next slide, Dan. So as we started to wonder about, how the heck do we control these APIs or secure these APIs, or at least validate a lot of the APIs are secure, one of the first things, that came to us is let's look at all the things that we have on our network, all the control levers that we can pull. Immediately, one of the first questions we get asked, right, when we describe a new risk in any organization is, wait, do we have a firewall that does this thing that, blocks bad guys? So almost everybody have firewalls, right? And back in the day, that was the thing to do to block attackers and hackers from entering your environment. And that is still, is considered as the only thing that you ever need to secure your environment. And partially, I think that's true, but at the same time, as all of you guys know, if you're attending this talk, you probably know firewall doesn't do a whole lot. A traditional network firewall doesn't do a lot for API-specific threats. The firewall at best can say, look, if it's a web traffic, I'm going to allow you, or I'm going to block you based on, the source or where the request is coming from, but it's not going to be able to look into the request and discern this is API or this is not API and take an action. So while I'm not discounting the importance of, traditional network firewall, it doesn't do a whole lot to address this API security. And then the next, the element that's available on the table to control this risk is WAF, right? 10 years ago, again, I think WAFs became a mainstream product. Every firewall vendor, that you can think of have, developed a WAF module. And I think in most organizations, if not all, regardless of the size, have some kind of web. Some have on-prem, some have cloud, and they are very good at detecting traditional web application threats, and they're very good at detecting those patterns. Have those signatures to block threats that are being exploited on traditional web applications. All the WAF is doing is monitor the request, peek into the packet, look at what kind of, web request it is, and kind of take an action against those requests based on packet rules and signatures that are defined. So web firewalls do get into the web application traffic, but having said that, for an API request, WAF is going to look into that request, and a lot of times you wouldn't know a good request from a bad request because, from an API request standpoint, it's going to look identical to a WAF. And not only that, it's not going to contain the business logic to understand what's valid versus, what's unauthorized. So a lot of the WAF vendors lately have been, touting enhancements and capabilities or features that allow them to do security for web applications as well as APIs. I'm still a little skeptical because I'm not seeing a lot of groundbreaking functionality come out there where you can really truly rely on WAFs. As of today, I think, in my opinion, a lot of the features coming out of the WAFs are not going to completely protect the APIs. So moving on from the WAF, another control point or choke point that some organizations will have, I'm not going to say everybody will have a component called API gateway, but I think large, institutions and medium institutions would likely have architected some kind of a choke point or an aggregation point to host or throttle all of the API traffic. The fancy term for this is API gateways. There's Apigee and there's, Amazon, and there's, whole sorts of gateway products being made and available in the industry. And a lot of times you hear those gateway vendors also tout some of the security capabilities, but long and short of it, right, it's a tool that's written to aggregate and manage APIs and control the deployment of APIs. It does have some security benefits. You can write a policy or a rule to say, you can request an API from such and such location, but not from another location. Or, you could do throttling to say Raghu can request 100 APIs per hour, but if you request 200, throttle him or block him. So there's some traffic shaping features that could help in helping us secure or control APIs, but it's not really a place or at least the solution hasn't morphed into a security-driven product yet. Again, the business logic functions and whatnot, API is going to be somewhat, gateway is going to be blind to those things at this point in time. So we moved on from, technology solutions, and then we said, look, don't we do a web application scan, right? In our company, we do scans, very, very frequently, at times daily, at times, sometimes weekly. If you look at, the scanning vendors, right, whether it's Tenable or Rapid7 or Qualys, they all conduct, not only infrastructure, but they also capabilities to support web applications. And some do claim, again, touching APIs, and we explored that option. And again, they're good at scanning traditional web applications, but they didn't, test or stress test APIs enough to give us the comfort that we needed. So we moved on from web app scans, and we said, look, let's ask our pen testers, right? Most companies would hire pen testers or maybe have internal pen test teams in some cases. And they are often charged to test web apps, systems, infrastructure, networks, and why not just throw in APIs too, right? And to that extent, right, pen testers do a good job, or in fact, great job in testing those APIs, because that's really a person sitting behind a computer, evaluating what APIs are exposed and what are the request and response sequences, what could be exploitable, and try those things, right? It's really a great tool, and we have found a significant amount of value by using that as a solution to get those testings done against our APIs and systems supporting those APIs and extract a lot of value. The one downside to that is, if you got, let's assume you got, 100 APIs, right? For sake of example, it's very practical. And you can tell the pen testers, these are your 100 APIs, go and come back in a week and tell me what you found, right? It's very manageable from that standpoint. Some organizations like ours have significantly large APIs than 100. So either, we ask our pen tester to test all those thousands and thousands of APIs, and he or she is probably not going to come back anytime soon with the results because just the list is so long. At the same time, right, you could hire, hundreds of pen testers to go, which is probably not feasible from an economic and also efficiency standpoint. So while pen testing APIs or specific APIs is important, it's not going to fully give us the confidence that your APIs are secure and you don't have any weaknesses in them that can be exploited by somebody out there. And one of the things we did earlier was increase the frequency of pen testing from annual to quarterly, right? Which is a slight improvement, right? I don't have to go entire year not knowing if our APIs are vulnerable or not. Now I can find that out in the same quarter. But having said that, right, in this day and age, if somebody has an API that's exploitable, an hour is too long to go, let alone a quarter, right? So it does help, but again, it's not practical. Nobody has unlimited budget nor unlimited amount of people to pen test APIs every single day or every single hour. So we looked at all of these solutions and we kind of extracted a lot of value we can get from all of these angles, right? We use VAPs, we use policies in our gateways. We have pen testers, we have scanning done, but even aggregating all of that stuff then gave us enough confidence that things are the way they should be. And Nida talked about several risks, right? We wouldn't be able to get 100% assurance that those risks are managed well, despite using all of these levers in succession or simultaneously. So that led us to look outside and said, look, what else is available? And I think this was a prime time when we initially started looking at it, because that's when I believe the vendors, also started recognizing some of the downsides or some of the opportunities existing. And almost, every product, every vendor had come out with some sort of a solution to manage this risk. I mean, if you ever explored security solutions and then looked for what solutions can offer API security, it's mind-bending, right? There are just so many products out there. Everybody claimed to have a patent and AI machine learning driven solution that magically fixes all of our security issues in our APIs. And I think security folks have heard this theme a number of times in the past, that you buy this and all your problems will go away. And we know enough to not trust that. So we sort of spent about 6 months looking at all of the different solutions out there. And a lot of them were very easy to pass, just looking at their approaches and what they do. Some we sort of evaluated to kind of test the validity of those claims and how well it's going to be applicable for our environment. And then we finally ended up choosing an approach that we're still pursuing. But at a high level, right, what I found looking at the space, a lot of the vendors that are in the market producing security solutions for APIs fall into two buckets. The first bucket, right, they kind of take one particular approach, and the second set of vendors take a slightly different approach. I'm going to high level talk about what we have found in the market, and then kind of tell you which approach we're using and what our experience has been so far taking that approach. So Dan, let's go to the next slide. Again, there's probably dozen or so or even more API security vendors out there today, and more coming. I also watch the venture capital funding on the security market, and it's surprising that API security is one of those fields where venture capitalists are increasingly funding more and more companies with solutions and API security than anything else. It used to be cloud security, a couple of years ago. Now everybody is investing into solutions that claim to do something with APIs. So going on to the first set of solutions that we found are the solutions that fit the first approach. These solutions, there are several vendors out there, several controls and options out there. Some have, require software to be installed on your systems, and some hook up with your API gateways. Some, want your network to be mirrored using span ports and sort of look into the traffic. But the name of the game here is, there's somebody sitting in between your client and your API endpoint and watching all of the requests. And or the period of time, but while watching those requests, that solution again is going to make up its mind on what the normal traffic is going to look like. What do the requests look like? Time of the day, the frequency, the volume, the components of the API request, what are the responses should look like. So it's going to establish some kind of a baseline. After a period of time, it learns the patterns. It knows what a normal is. And by design, right, it's going to know what something that's not normal is. So based on that analysis, after a period of time, those solutions are going to start spitting out alerts to say, hey, I'm seeing something that's odd. I've not seen this before. And it's up to the organization to do something about it. Either investigate it and determine that to be a false positive, or maybe it's true exploitation of an API from a threat attacker, and you got to look at whether that attacker was successful in exploiting it. If so, how do you control it? Sometimes you go back to the API endpoint and fix the root cause of it, and sometimes some of the solutions also provide capabilities to block such requests in future if it were to reoccur by taking an action against it. So there are some benefits in this, which is, look, if you don't have to do anything, you let the solution decide what's good and what's bad. So it's more or less a plug-and-play solution, and it's going to tell you if something is odd. But one of the downsides is if nobody attacks you for the first month while the solution is establishing a baseline, the solution is not going to know anything what a bad traffic looks like. So when it happens for the first time, it's not going to block the attack because it's not going to know what's normal and what's not normal. Second, right, if that attack hasn't been seen before, it's not going to be able to recognize and block or even alert. That's one of the biggest downsides. And then it also requires some sort of architectural change if your organization is not ready to make this monitoring possible. Some solutions do this monitoring in the cloud. Some are capable of monitoring this traffic on-prem. Some organizations may not be open to let another solution monitor this traffic because a lot of times, APIs are exchanging PII, transactional details. That's very, sensitive data. And there are some also concerns that it can add latency to your API traffic because there's another middleman doing inspection and policy enforcement. The more elements you have, the slower the response would be for API endpoints. And again, those are some of the concerns that we have felt with some of these solutions. But on the pro side, right, the beauty is, again, if you don't know anything, you want a plug-and-play solution. If you don't have good documentation of the APIs. This sort of solutions that fit this approach or that take this approach may be ideal. We looked into it. We kind of passed on this just because we wanted something that provides a comprehensive coverage, and we don't want to leave it for chance in terms of exposing a API security vulnerability and having it exposed for the first time. One time is too many from an API exploitation perspective, and frank, like any security product, right? So while this is good and it has a lot of pros and cons for this approach, we kind of passed on this approach and then looked at other solutions that slightly took a different approach. So then let's look at the next slide. So there are, again, a set of solutions in the market that take a very different approach, which is, testing APIs, right? The age-old best practice is test before you promote a code to deployment or production, which is still valid. One thing with APIs is, unlike the traditional applications, APIs get touched, updated, released on a routine basis, right? Every day, every hour. That's one of the beauties and perils of APIs. The release cycles are a lot shorter, where it may not be practical to test every single time before you update it. And then sometimes you haven't touched the API and API hasn't changed, but a new weakness was discovered. So you got to have a solution, or you have to take an approach where you're testing those APIs around the clock, and that's continuous testing approach. And that's slightly what we felt comfortable that, this is the approach we should take to get our command and control from an API security standpoint. The beauty of this is, when it's all said and done, regardless of how many APIs we have, those will be tested just like the pen testers would test against all of the OWASP, top 10 API and more are custom to our environment around the clock, regardless of whether API was developed, not developed, or touched or not updated, regardless of what. We're adopting this approach because you may not have changed an API, but perhaps your gateway configuration may have changed, undoing some of the security controls or protections. So this takes a assumption that, we don't care if something happened or didn't happen. We're going to test this around the clock. And if something was discovered from a weakness standpoint, there's an alert that goes to security team. Says, look, we have a new API vulnerability that needs to be addressed the right way. So the beauty of this is you're going to be most likely the first person to know if there's a weakness that was introduced or a weakness that was discovered, not the hacker, because you're doing it around the clock. At worst, you're discovering this at the same time the bad guys are discovering. So you have an opportunity to take the first step and defend against the attack, as opposed to discovering it later down the road. One of the challenges we ran into with this is, again, I think Nida was talking about API governance. A lot of the organizations, have the mentality of developing API first and then the governance comes later. And I think, I'm not going to be pretending here to say, we have a solid governance, but I think those are some of the challenges we ran into. APIs get developed, in several areas within the company. They may or may not use the gateway, and some APIs get deprecated, but they're still alive on the network and being available for someone to call. So the governance became an important element, and that governance also feeds into this second approach because you got to know what APIs to test, and if you don't know an API exists, you're not going to be able to test it. And documentation is also going to be very important. In fact, that was one of the biggest challenges we had. Some of the APIs that were developed years ago perhaps had incomplete documentation. So we needed to spend extra time to kind of break open this code and try to figure out what the heck this API was trying to do and articulate a spec from it so that, once you have a spec, we could figure out what test cases to write, and what to test against that API. So these sort of solutions, understand your API spec, whether it's Swagger or OpenAPI, and automatically create, several hundred to 1,000 test cases, all aligned to OWASP, and automatically execute those test cases and let the customer know if something was found. So what the solutions here in the second approach are trying to do is replicate what a manual pen tester does, but in an automated fashion. And this is one way that we can slice and dice this. And when you think about approaches, right, the first approach or solutions that belong to the first set and second set are complementary. I mean, if some organization has budget and people to afford both, I would probably recommend to do both. But as a mid-sized organization, if we have to pick one, I felt that we had a lot more confidence that we would get better results and more comprehensive results using solutions that fit this second bucket. So that's pretty much our journey. I think we're still in progress of executing this. We started the journey about 8 months ago. We've been very impressed with the confidence that gives us once we're getting the results from testing this around the clock. We're sort of adopting this as a standard, so that going forward, if we were to develop new API, now this becomes part of a release cycle. That this API gets onboarded, tested around the clock, and we exactly know what to do when something was discovered on this APIs. So that's in a gist. But again, like I said, right, this is a journey. It's not a quick fix like the solutions that are inline or mirroring the traffic. It takes time, depending on how many APIs an organization has and how well they're documented. But when you get to the end result, you're going to end up in a place where you have a whole lot more confidence that your APIs are in a good shape, as opposed to the approaches that rely on behavior or pattern matching. So that's in a gist. I'm going to stay online and take some of the questions, but I believe Dan has a quick demo kind of showing what his solution is going to look like and which bucket this is going to fit.
Thank you so much, Sir Raghu. What a great insight from someone on the front lines here. And so, yeah, in the few minutes left, let me give a couple of thoughts here on what you just described, and a quick demonstration on how one can actually automate and make continuous their API testing. This, I think, is probably going to be well understood by everyone on the call. Why are attackers looking at the API layer? And really, it's quite simple, right? The APIs are that gateway. They're really the conduit, the face of the backend application, the backend data, and where there are any loopholes or vulnerabilities that can exist in the API or in the application logic, that's where we're seeing the breaches take place. All right, so to your point, Raghu, the firewalls, the WAFs, even the API gateways are not looking at this level of detail, the underlying functionality, the logic of an application, and that's where we're seeing the vulnerabilities exist. And sure enough, this is probably one of the most highly cited statistics or quotes, but indeed, this very year we're already seeing evidence of APIs being the #1 attack vector. And the examples are all over the place, right? Here's just a small sampling, and not to point fingers. These are all very smart organizations that are employing many of the technologies that Raghu described, and yet still falling victim. And what we find with API type breaches, you don't lose 100 or 1,000 records. It's counted in the millions, right? At Postal Service, 60 million accounts harvested through an API that allowed user A to pivot and access user B's data, or an unsecured endpoint at Peloton that revealed the entire 4 million user database, or even just this week at Coinbase, a bug bounty hacker discovered, and this is in the Coinbase's own words, an underlying bug that was missing a logic validation check. It allowed a user to actually sell crypto that belonged to another account effectively. These are not your classic security type of vulnerabilities. These are not SQL injections or cross-site scripting or buffer overflow or things like that. The nature of these breaches, the attackers are leveraging loopholes or logic flaws that exist in the underlying application itself. And so those are much more difficult to discover, certainly more difficult to detect in real time, to Raghu's point, and challenging to even discover with manual testing. So what we do at APIsec is we offer a fully automated API testing platform. Really does three main things. We're going to analyze your API down to each individual function, each endpoint, and really understand the underlying logic of your API. We then apply hundreds of attack categories that are customized to your API logic. And then we run the scans. This is all done automatically, so you can run this in a fully continuous manner. So every release, every push to production gets evaluated, and critically, you're finding these vulnerabilities before they go live, before they make it to production and can cause you any harm. One of the other benefits of this is that it is extremely lightweight from a deployment perspective. So no source code needed. You can't find these types of logic flaws by analyzing the code itself. That's fine for looking for, vulnerable libraries or poor coding practices, but not for finding logic flaws. There's really nothing to install in this model. We're just simply acting as a user or a client engaging with your API, and nothing in line, no network changes, no latency, no additional man in the middle analyzing or inspecting your traffic. And let me just show a very brief demonstration of this. Here we go. So this is our UI. There's really two ways to get started. You can connect this into your API gateway, like in Apigee, MuleSoft, Kong, AWS, Azure, and we fetch automatically all of the details of your APIs and discover them there. Or you can register your API manually, simply by providing some sort of specification file, really just an inventory of what endpoints exist in your API. In this case, I've got one already loaded. We're going to analyze or dissect the functionality of your API. In this case, it's a banking app, so there are bank account functions, withdrawal functions, deposit, and so forth. Looking at any input parameters that we can build tests against, what type of methods are available, but really building a logic map of your API. We then apply these security categories, and this is going to cover all of the OWASP top 10 plus much more. Our labs team are continuously building and enhancing this library of attack categories, but you'll see attribute-based access control categories, or can user A access user B, authentication exploits and unsecured endpoints. There's sensitive data exposure, excess data exposure, use of incremental IDs, and on and on. You'll recognize many of these categories from the OWASP top 10. And what our engine is going to do is take those categories and apply them onto your API and your specific logic and produce playbooks. In this case, over 1,200 different playbooks, which you're welcome to go in and take a look at. But the main point is you are going to have this blanket coverage of testing on your API that will then run automatically on every build. And if I show you our integrations, you can wire APIsec right into your CI/CD pipeline, for example. So if you're running Jenkins or GitHub Actions, you can actually invoke APIsec on every build. So if you're doing a nightly build, you're going to get a nightly scan of your APIs as well. So if there's any changes that are happening, you will discover them. In this case, we ran those scans, found 19 vulnerabilities, and they all show up down here as results to look at. And if I take you into one of these in particular, I want to sort of share with you how sophisticated this testing can be. If you need to learn more about that particular vulnerability, we give you a lot of information, the description, the severity, its impact, how is it exploited, as well as remediation guidance. How do you go about addressing this vulnerability? And then, because this is APIs, it's all machine to machine. So we give you a recording of all the calls and responses to that API. In this case, let me walk you through the example. It's a banking app, so the test starts by hitting the endpoint called transfers, authenticating with a test account called user A, and we're going to create a new transfer. Here's the request. We get a 200 response from the API, and the API delivers this payload back to us, including a transaction ID. This is a unique identifier for the transfer I just created. That's all fine, but now we're going to come back in the second step, and we're going to go back to that endpoint, append that transfer ID, and we're going to look it up, but as user B, a different test account. So we created the transfer as user A, and now we're going to see if we can access it as user B. All of our tests are going to have a hypothesis or an assertion of what we expect the response to be. In this case, some sort of denial, a 401, 403, an error code, forbidden. But actually what we got back was a 200. That is successful. And in fact, the API returned all of this detail about that transfer to user B. And this is just one simple example of how our platform is actually going to exercise the logic of your API, not just look for unsecured endpoints or injection vulnerabilities and the like. So hopefully that gives you a quick feel for how you can actually automate this and make this level of assessment part of your daily process. So with that, let me just thank Nida and Raghu for joining me today. Really been a fantastic conversation. My name's Dan. I welcome any of you to reach out to me. There's my email address, so please make note of it. We have a couple of offers to folks here on the call. Number one, we offer a free API security test. You literally can just go to this website, fill out the form, apply or point us at your API details, and run a test live. And we'll be happy to meet with you and share more of the results and even do more sophisticated or in-depth types of testing. And we also are offering a free book. It's just come out from our friend Corey Ball, who is a professional API pen tester. The Hacking APIs book is a really fantastic read. And if you'd be interested in a copy, please get in touch and I'll be happy to get one into your hands. And so with that, Raghu and Nida, we do have quite a few questions popping through here. First one I'll hit is, will there be a copy of the presentation recording available? Yes, by all means, we'll definitely be posting the recording within 24 hours, so look out for that, and we'll send out an email as well. This one, maybe I'll start with you, Nida. Can we get information on API threat modeling? So I know you'd mentioned that in one of your slides. Can you add some color to that? Oh, I think you're on mute, Nida.
Absolutely. So I would say threat modeling should not just be limited to APIs. There are classic methodologies such as Stride, that you can apply to testing your APIs. So as I said, just use what you have. Take a look at your threat modeling processes. Look at Stride. I highly recommend that you look at Stride, and also look at, from a vulnerabilities perspective, look at Dread, and those would be very useful for your testing.
Fantastic.
And Stride, by the way, is Microsoft standard. It was developed and advanced by Microsoft, and it's widely used. So I would recommend you get familiar with that type of testing.
Excellent. Thank you, Nida. This one is probably for Raghu. And it might have been before you had completed all your slides, but what is your approach? How can you protect API, and what are most common vulnerabilities and API flaws which we should protect?
Wow, that's a loaded question. In my experience, right, of looking at what it takes to protect thousands of APIs or endpoints and what I've found in experience in terms of, what type of those vulnerabilities are most common. It's almost always a very simple weakness that I find very, very commonly. And it's not super technical, and it's not something we can blame our developers. It doesn't require somebody to take secure coding course. It's a simple misconfiguration. And it's very, very easy to fix, but equally dangerous because a lot of times none of the tools that we use to detect these misconfigurations are completely blind from those things. The only time you would find out is, somebody calls you up and said, were you aware we called that API and didn't require a password, or, I'm not supposed to be, seeing that API, but I see it. And that's almost scary because, they're very easy to introduce because somebody changed big in a gateway or someplace, and suddenly something that was only supposed to be facing internal network is now exposed to anybody can call. And God forbid if you don't have authentication or more sophisticated mechanism to authenticate them, that API was responding to everybody that ever requested. So if I have to name one, and of course, OWASP has a top 10 API security vulnerabilities. These are so dangerous that OWASP has set up a completely different top 10 list, unlike the traditional web app vulnerabilities. Misconfiguration would be my top number one. That again is very easy to fix, but also, most people ignore it, and you don't know if you have that weakness unless you confirm it. So one of the tests that we perform on our APIs is simply that. Can you talk to this API? And does it require authentication? Does it require a token, or does it require you to come from a specific network? So I think if you were to do one thing, only one thing, check to make sure your APIs are not vulnerable to this configuration issue.
Thank you for that, Raghu. I'm going to try to get a couple more questions in for the hour. Nida, the ideas you present are helpful to guide us on best practices. Do you have advice on how to speak with leadership to get budget and make API security a priority?
Certainly, and this is really important. As I said earlier, we need to look at these innovations as financial leadership within the United States is paramount. So adoption of innovative platforms and technologies like cloud, APIs, and artificial intelligence are really very important for maintaining the financial leadership of the U.S. financial sector. So I would encourage you all to kind of look at what's happening in the financial sector, look at the fintech companies and their use of APIs and totally digitalized platforms using APIs and using cloud infrastructures. I would encourage you to talk to your leadership about the necessity of innovation, continued innovation, because technology is a source of innovation and it could help the organization be very productive, more competitive, and it also opens the platforms for new services and new ways of delivery. I'd encourage you to use the analogy. I mean, we had the mainframe, we had the client server, we had the web, and now this is it. This is the way of the 21st century. You adopt it, or you just suffer the consequence of becoming obsolete or not competitive. So I think it's very important to talk to your leadership about the imperativeness or importance of keeping the U.S. financial sector healthy, competitive, and on the forefront of technology. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And one last question. I'll send this to you, Raghu. Any considerations for potential business metrics, impacts through API since they are tested continuously? So any kind of metrics or how are you measuring results?
And that is one of those things we're working on right now. We're a highly metric-driven team. We measure everything that can be measurable in cybersecurity. We're currently working on developing some API security metrics. The popular ones are going to be, how many API endpoints provide PII responses. Exactly, which ones respond back with, let's say, address, which ones respond back with account balances. which ones respond back with account numbers. And we want to measure those so that we know which ones are critical APIs, which ones are exposed to entire internet, ratio of endpoints that are IP whitelisted, let's say, the ratio of endpoints that are transactional nature. So again, all of those metrics are very, very important to understand your landscape. And also when there's a deviation, let's say, your publicly exposed endpoints went from, 10 to 15, that's an indicator. What happened? What changed? Who changed it? Is that a risk? So those all metrics are not only going to be business friendly, but also indicate threat, indicate changes. They also tell you have, control over your environment, and something changes, you're very quick to detect it.
Wonderful. There are many more questions. So for everyone that we didn't get to, I promise I'll follow up with you and we'll make sure we get responses to you. Nida and Raghu, thank you so much for being with me today. Really wonderful session. Like I said, our highest attended by far, and folks staying right through the whole hour. So thanks again for being with us. To everyone online, we will send out the follow-up and recordings. And we appreciate you taking time to be with us this morning. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.